August 1944. Fort Lewis, Washington. A young German soldier named Günter Gräwe stood in front of a small camp canteen, staring at two items on a shelf behind reinforced glass. In his hand, he held 80 cents a day's wages for work, picking apples in the orchards surrounding the prisoner of war camp. Before him sat an ice cream cone and a bottle of Coca-Cola. In that moment, standing inside a barbed wire enclosure thousands of miles from home, Günter Gräwe experienced something his military handlers never intended. He experienced a choice. Not the choice between two luxuries that was impossible in wartime Germany. He experienced the choice between two abundant luxuries, both simultaneously available, both affordable on a prisoner's wage. Gräwe would later write, "The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola? Never before. So I decided to take both. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was not the realization he was supposed to have. Günter Gräwe was a soldier of the Wehrmacht, trained to believe in German superiority, in the inevitable triumph of the Reich, in the correctness of his cause. Yet standing in that camp canteen, holding both a cold ice cream and a foreign soft drink in his hands simultaneously, luxuries that represented scarcity itself in his homeland, something shifted. Not his allegiance, perhaps, but his certainty, his understanding of why he had lost, his comprehension of what he had been fighting against. Günter Gräwe's awakening was not unique. It was one of 425,000 moments, spread across 500 prisoner of war camps, stretching from Maine to California, where German soldiers experienced the same collision between their expectations and American reality, between what Berlin had told them to expect and what they actually encountered when they stepped off the ships that brought them across the Atlantic. The mathematics of this realization are themselves revealing. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners arrived on American shores. The vast majority came in the hulls of Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that symbolized American industrial might. These same Liberty ships that German military planners had assumed would be sunk by U-boat wolfpacks faster than America could replace them. These same ships that were supposed to represent America's industrial vulnerability. Yet they kept arriving, month after month, year after year, each one delivering 30,000 prisoners or more, each one representing American industrial capacity that existed not in some theoretical future, but in the present tense, in the immediate, in the undeniable. The question that began to form in the minds of German prisoners was not whether America was winning. By 1944, that was evident to anyone with a functional brain. The question was something far more unsettling. It was whether Germany had ever had a chance. It was whether the war, from its inception, had been mathematically impossible to win. It was whether German soldiers had been asked to die not for victory, but for the theatre of defeat. The realization did not come from propaganda. It did not come from American re-education programs or democracy courses or the distribution of banned books. Those programs existed, certainly. Camps published 135 newspapers. Special projects divisions conducted re-education programs reaching 40,000 prisoners, but these were formal, official mechanisms. The true education happened in silence. It happened in the canteen. It happened in the kitchen. It happened in the observation of simple, material facts. When Günter Gräwe arrived at Fort Lewis in 1944, after his capture in North Africa, he was fed. Not scarcely, not rationed, but genuinely fed. The Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners receive the same rations as their guards. American military regulations required it. But the reality exceeded the mandate. The abundance wasn't theoretical. A German prisoner at Fort Lewis ate meat with his meal. He received fresh vegetables. He received bread, butter, sugar. These were not luxuries allocated to privileged officers or special cases. These were standard rations for enlisted prisoners. In Germany, by 1944, the average German civilian had fallen to subsistence levels of nutrition. The Wehrmacht itself was beginning to experience systematic hunger. Yet here, in a prisoner of war camp in rural Washington state, enemy soldiers ate better than the citizens of the nation whose soldiers they had been. This contradiction was not lost on the men. One captured German officer, upon learning the caloric content of the American prison ration compared to what he understood German civilians were receiving at home, made a statement that would be repeated throughout camps. In Germany, we eat less than we do here as prisoners in America. The official records document the shock of arrival. Upon reaching America, after the transatlantic crossing in Liberty ships, German prisoners were transported by Pullman railroad cars to their assigned camps. One soldier wrote home, describing the train cars, the comfort of the seating, the efficiency of American transportation infrastructure. "We traveled in comfort," he noted, a phrase that carried weight. Comfort was not a word associated with German military logistics by 1944. Comfort was not a word associated with German civilian life. Comfort was a luxury that had evaporated into the past. Yet here it was, offered to prisoners, as if it were routine, as if America possessed such surplus capacity that even the transportation of captured enemies could be conducted with comfort. The towns shocked them as well. As the Pullman cars moved from embarkation points toward inland camps, German prisoners gazed out at the American countryside. What they witnessed was not destruction. There were no bombed-out buildings. There were no visible signs of rationing. There were no skeletal civilians searching for food. Instead, they saw shops with goods displayed in windows. They saw farms producing abundantly. They saw roads in good repair, vehicles functioning, industrial infrastructure intact. One German prisoner, after months in captivity, attempted to articulate what the landscape meant. "We realized that Germany had lost the war before it began, not because of tactics or strategy, but because the mathematics of production made German victory impossible." The revelation crystallized around specific, observable facts. German prisoners worked on American farms. As they harvested crops, they observed the scale of American agriculture. In Nebraska, 12,000 German prisoners were distributed across farms. In Idaho, the J.R. Simplot Company employed 2,000 German prisoners in dehydrated potato factories. These were not token labor forces. These were substantial mobilizations of enemy manpower, yet American agriculture seemed barely to notice their absence from the market. American production continued. American surpluses accumulated. Prisoners witnessed the mechanics of industrial abundance that had been theoretically described but never truly comprehended in their training. The pay structure deepened the shock. A German prisoner earned 80 cents per day, paid in American dollars when working. This was not a pittance. Converted to purchasing power in the camp canteen, it represented genuine wealth. A prisoner could buy cigarettes, candy, writing paper, books. In German camps holding American prisoners, by contrast, the International Red Cross documented that such luxuries were simply unavailable. German civilians, by 1944, could not purchase ice cream or soft drinks at any price. Yet a prisoner held by America could accumulate these goods, own them, consume them, almost casually. The canteen itself became a symbol. Camp canteens operated with prisoner labor, stocked with goods purchased from American suppliers. The range of items available, candy, tobacco, newspapers, magazines, books, writing materials, represented a surplus that defied comprehension to men from a rationing economy. One prisoner wrote, "I could buy things here that have not existed in Germany for years, not because they were strategically withheld, but because there were no resources to produce them anymore." The food, though, remained the primary language through which this realization was expressed. American military regulations required feeding prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. But American food production had become something almost obscene by comparison to European scarcity. A typical day's ration for a German prisoner included meat, real meat, not the stretched substitutes of wartime Germany. The kitchens at camps like Fort Lewis prepared meals that would have seemed extravagant to German civilians. Potatoes, vegetables, bread, coffee, sugar, Milk. These were standard components of daily meals, not special allocations for holidays or celebrations. They were routine. American guards, by contrast, ate the same food. The Geneva Convention mandated equal treatment. But what this meant in practice was that American soldiers, fighting a global war, were eating food of such abundance that they could share it equally with their prisoners without noticeable diminishment. That was the real shock. Not that prisoners were fed, but that the food was abundant enough to feed prisoners at the same level as the military forces defending America, with no apparent strain on production. Letters home, when censored and released, captured the confusion. Prisoners attempted to describe the experience to families living in a Germany of increasingly scarce resources. But how do you articulate abundance to people experiencing scarcity? How do you explain that your enemy feeds you better than your own nation feeds its civilians? Some letters were simply destroyed by German censors, deemed too demoralizing to permit circulation. The reality was too dangerous. If ordinary Germans learned that prisoners held in America lived in relative plenty while the civilian population experienced deprivation, it threatened the psychological coherence necessary for continued resistance. By 1944, the realization had crystallized into something close to certainty among German prisoners. The war was not being decided by superior tactics or strategic brilliance. It was being decided by the capacity of American factories to produce Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, by the capacity of American agriculture to generate surplus while feeding both civilians and prisoners, by the capacity of American industry to produce ice cream and Coca-Cola and cigarettes and writing paper even while simultaneously producing weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and aircraft, by the capacity to sustain all of this while maintaining the comfort of Pullman railroad cars for prisoner transport. One captured officer, in a report later declassified, summarized the consensus that had formed: "We lost because America is rich and we are poor, not because of Hitler's genius or the superiority of our soldiers. We lost because, if America decides to build 10,000 of something, they build 10,000 of something. If Germany decides to build 5,000 of something, we build 5,000 of something. And if we decide to build 10,000 of something, we do not have the resources, so we do not build it." The war was mathematics, and America's mathematics was superior. This was the realization that no propaganda could have created, and no amount of official re-education could have accelerated. It came from observation. It came from the material reality of American industrial capacity, expressed not in abstract statistics, but in the concrete experience of abundance in food, in comfort, in choice, in the simple ability to buy both an ice cream and a Coca-Cola with a day's wages earned as a prisoner of war. The transformation from this realization was neither rapid nor absolute. German prisoners did not suddenly become American patriots. Loyalty to their homeland did not evaporate. But something shifted. A certainty broke. A myth fractured. The belief in inevitable German victory, which had been taught to every soldier, began to be replaced by something closer to mathematical understanding. We lost because we could not outproduce them. We lost because they could feed their prisoners better than we could feed our civilians. We lost because the foundational assumption of our military strategy, that American industrial capacity was fragile and could be broken, was catastrophically wrong. For Günter Gräwe, standing in that camp canteen in August of 1944, holding both an ice cream and a Coca-Cola in his hands, this realization came crystallized in a moment of sensory abundance. For others, it came more gradually, through the accumulation of observations, through letters from home describing deepening privation, through the daily experience of being fed better as a captured enemy than they would have been as free civilians in their homeland. The question that haunted German prisoners, in the silence of their bunks at night, became less about whether Germany could win, and more about what kind of nation they were living in that it could lose so thoroughly. What kind of enemy was so wealthy that it could afford to feed its captives abundantly? What kind of industrial system could produce not just weapons of war, but also ice cream and soft drinks? What kind of military force could transport prisoners in comfort on Pullman railroad cars? These were the questions that the German officers, many of them educated men, began to ask. These were the questions that reshaped how they understood the war, its causes, and its inevitability. And these were the questions that, when repatriation finally came, many of them carried back to Germany. They carried back not just memories of captivity, but a transformed understanding of why their nation had lost. They carried back testimony to the reality that American industrial capacity was not a theoretical advantage, but a material, observable, undeniable fact. This was the education that mattered, not the books banned in Nazi Germany that were distributed in camps, not the democracy courses taught by American officers, not the newspapers published in camps promoting American values. It was the education of abundance. It was the education of material reality. It was the education that came from observing, directly and without mediation, what American industrial capacity looked like when expressed in the form of an ice cream cone and a bottle of Coca-Cola simultaneously available to a prisoner of war with a single day's wages. The shipyards existed on the periphery of this prisoner experience, referenced but rarely witnessed directly. German prisoners were deliberately housed in camps distant from major industrial installations. This was policy, not accident. American military planners understood that allowing prisoners close proximity to active war production might inspire escape attempts or provide intelligence that could be conveyed back to Germany. Yet even from a distance, the reality of American shipbuilding capacity penetrated into the consciousness of prisoners through reports, through conversations, through the simple mathematics of transport. The Liberty ships that had carried prisoners across the Atlantic became, in a sense, the primary symbol of American industrial capacity. The German military had understood the significance of these vessels from their inception. U-boat commanders had been ordered to target them with ferocity. Every Liberty ship sunk represented a victory, a reduction in American carrying capacity, a potential bottleneck in the pipeline of supplies flowing to Britain and eventually to the invasion forces building up in England. German naval strategy centered on the assumption that Liberty ships could be sunk faster than America could replace them. This was not an unreasonable assumption based on historical precedent. In previous wars, shipping shortages had crippled supply lines. In this war, the strategy should have worked. Except it did not. By 1944, American shipyards were producing Liberty ships at a rate that exceeded anything German planners had theoretically modeled. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, operated 4 separate yards that collectively turned out hundreds of vessels. The average construction time for a Liberty ship had been reduced from 230 days at the beginning of the program to approximately 14 days by the middle of the war. In November of 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary had been constructed in 4 days and 15 hours, essentially demonstrating that American yards could now produce vessels faster than they could be sunk. One yard could launch as many as 3 ships in a single day at peak production. 3 complete cargo vessels, each capable of carrying 9,000 tons of cargo, produced in 24 hours by a single facility. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence officers understood what these numbers meant, even if some in the political leadership chose not to fully accept the implications. If America could produce 3 Liberty ships per day, and if each ship represented carrying capacity for supplies, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, and troops, then the war had become a mathematical impossibility for Germany. Every ship sunk could be replaced within days. Every supply shortage could be overcome by the next convoy. The strategy of economic attrition that had worked against Britain now failed because America possessed industrial capacity that literally exceeded the capacity of Germany to destroy it through any means available. The prisoners knew these facts. Not from technical specifications, they were soldiers, not engineers, but from the simple reality that they kept arriving, month after month. 30,000 prisoners per month arriving in American ports, transported by Liberty ships, distributed to camps across the country. And behind them came the supplies. More Liberty ships, more cargo. an apparently endless stream of material abundance being poured into the American war effort. One captured German officer, in a report compiled after the war by American military historians, articulated the realization clearly. "We were told that if we could sink the American merchant fleet, we could starve Britain and prevent any invasion of Europe. We believed this. It was logical. What we did not understand was that America's capacity to build merchant ships had exceeded the entire industrial output of Germany. We could not sink them faster than they made them. By the time we understood this reality, it was too late to change strategy. The war was already lost. It had been lost before it began, lost in the calculations and production figures of American industry. This realization that the war's outcome had been determined not by tactics or strategy or the bravery of soldiers, but by the fundamental mathematics of industrial production, transformed how German prisoners understood their defeat. It was not a failure of courage. German soldiers had fought with extraordinary bravery and discipline. It was not a failure of strategy. German officers had demonstrated tactical brilliance in numerous engagements. It was a failure of nation-state. Germany simply did not possess the industrial capacity to engage in a prolonged war against an enemy like America. The contrast became even more stark when prisoners considered the alternatives. They knew what Soviet captivity meant. Letters from fellow soldiers captured by the Soviets rarely arrived. When they did, they described horrors. Soviet POW camps offered no comfort, no adequate food, no medical care, no canteen system offering luxuries like ice cream and Coca-Cola. Soviet captivity meant starvation, disease, forced labor in Siberia, and a high probability of death. By comparison, American captivity seemed almost beneficent, yet even this apparent beneficence was rooted in American abundance. America could afford to treat prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards because America had enough resources to do so. The Soviet Union could not afford such treatment because it did not have enough resources for its own people. This realization created a strange psychological state among German prisoners. They were enemies held in captivity. Yet they lived better than they would have lived in their own homeland. They were prisoners of war, yet they experienced more security than free German civilians. The contradiction was irresolvable except through a single acknowledgement. Germany had lost, fundamentally, because it lacked the industrial capacity to win. The food continued to be the primary language through which this realization was expressed. American military rations for prisoners were standardized. A typical meal included a portion of meat, usually beef or pork, fresh or canned vegetables, bread, butter, sugar for coffee or tea, milk when available. These components were not luxuries allocated sparingly. They were standard components of the daily diet. This ration was calculated to provide approximately 3,000 calories per day, adequate for men performing work but not luxurious. Yet in Germany, by 1944, the average civilian ration had fallen to approximately 1,900 calories per day. The Wehrmacht itself, though receiving more generous rations than civilians, was experiencing increasing food shortages. Officers' rations had been reduced. Enlisted men were going hungry. The Eastern Front was characterized by systematic hunger among German troops. Supply lines from occupied territories were breaking down. The internal economy of Germany was collapsing from insufficient resources to feed the population and sustain the military simultaneously. A German prisoner receiving the standard American ration was therefore receiving approximately 50% more calories than German civilians, and in many cases more than German soldiers fighting on active fronts. This was not kindness or generosity on the part of Americans. This was simply the standard application of Geneva Convention provisions by an industrial nation that possessed sufficient resources to provide such rations. Germany could not provide equivalent rations to its own soldiers and prisoners because Germany did not have sufficient resources. America could provide such rations to prisoners, to soldiers, to civilians, and to the massive mobilization of war production simultaneously. The mathematics of this reality was devastating. One prisoner articulated it in a letter that survived censorship. "We are fed as if we are valuable. In Germany, we would be valued, and yet not fed? This is not a moral distinction. This is an economic reality. America has enough. Germany does not. When you have enough and your enemy does not, you win the war. This is all there is to understand. The realization of American industrial capacity was further reinforced by the equipment prisoners observed. American military uniforms were standardized, durable, and provided to all soldiers. German uniforms, by contrast, were deteriorating, with insufficient replacements. American rifles, trucks, and equipment were well maintained and abundant. German equipment was cannibalized and improvised. American soldiers were equipped with sufficient ammunition that training exercises could be conducted with live fire. German soldiers were rationing ammunition. The difference was not in military strategy or command competence. The difference was in the fundamental capacity to produce the material basis of modern warfare. Some prisoners attempted to articulate this realization to their interrogators and to American officers, perhaps hoping to earn better treatment or to engage in conversation that acknowledged their intellectual capacity to understand their situation. One such conversation, documented in the oral history archives, involved a German officer explaining to an American intelligence officer, "You Americans do not understand your own advantage. You believe it is because you are smarter or braver or more moral. This is not true. You have won because you are rich. You have factories everywhere. You have raw materials everywhere. You have food everywhere. We do not have these things. When you can make 1,000 of something and we can make 100 of something, you will win. We knew this might happen, but we believed our weapons would be superior. They were, but they were not superior enough to overcome the difference in our productive capacities. We made the best tanks in the world. You made more tanks. More of the less good tank beats fewer of the best tank every time. This is not strategy. This is arithmetic. The acceptance of this reality was neither universal nor immediate among German prisoners. Committed Nazis in the camps resisted it. They maintained that the war was far from over, that Germany was developing new weapons that would reverse the situation, that the will to victory and the ideological commitment of the German people would ultimately prevail. But even these committed ideologues faced the simple contradiction of their situation. They were prisoners, eating better food than German civilians, living in more security than German soldiers on active duty, existing in an enemy nation that possessed sufficient resources to feed them adequately, while simultaneously producing weapons, ammunition, and industrial goods at a scale that defied comprehension. For many prisoners, this realization led to a kind of resignation that was not quite despair but something close to it. The war would be lost not because of any moral failing or lack of bravery, but because the arithmetic of industrial capacity had determined the outcome before the war even began. Germany had entered into a conflict with an enemy that possessed approximately 10 times the industrial capacity of Germany. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome such a disparity. No amount of ideological commitment could transform economic reality. By late 1944, when most of these German prisoners were interned in American camps, the outcome was clear to anyone willing to acknowledge mathematical reality. Germany was losing because it could not outproduce America. Liberty ships were being built faster than U-boats could sink them. American factories were producing weapons at rates that exceeded German production by orders of magnitude. American agriculture was producing surpluses that could feed prisoners and civilians while sustaining a global military mobilization. Germany could not do any of these things simultaneously. The prisoners who worked on American farms, who received American rations, who had access to the camp canteen with its abundance of goods, who could purchase ice cream and soft drinks and cigarettes and writing paper with a day's wages. These men understood something that many military planners in Berlin refused to acknowledge. They understood that the war was over, not in the formal sense. The fighting would continue, but in the decisive sense, the war had been lost years before. It had been lost in the fundamental disparity between American industrial capacity and German industrial capacity. It had been lost in the ability of America to produce an abundance of material goods that exceeded what Germany could produce in scarcity. It had been lost in the simple mathematical fact that 3 Liberty ships per day, sustained over years, represented an industrial capacity that could not be matched or overcome by any strategy or tactic available to Germany. This realization, which came to so many German prisoners through the simple observation of American abundance, would shape their understanding of the war and its causes for the rest of their lives. When they returned to Germany, after the war's end, they would carry with them not just memories of their captivity, but testimony to the material reality of American industrial supremacy. They would describe the food, the equipment, the infrastructure, the simple ability of America to waste or to produce in abundance what Germany could not produce at all. They would try to explain to a devastated German population how it was that they had been defeated not by any particular tactic or strategy, but by the fundamental economic structure of their enemy. Some would become influential figures in post-war Germany. Walter Hallstein, imprisoned at Fort Getty and educated in American democracy programs, would later help design the European Economic Community. Hans Kroll, held at Camp Shelby, would become West German ambassador to the United States. Rüdiger von Verhaar, detained at Camp Herne, would serve as German permanent representative to the United Nations. These men, like so many of their fellow prisoners, would be shaped not primarily by formal re-education, but by the material evidence of American industrial capacity that they encountered every day in the camps. For Günter Gräwe, standing in that camp canteen in 1944, the choice between ice cream and Coca-Cola was not merely a choice between 2 consumer goods. It was a choice that symbolized something far larger. It represented the capacity of an enemy nation to produce such abundance that even prisoners could access luxuries. It represented the reality that Germany had lost not because its soldiers were inferior or its officers less capable, but because its industrial foundation could not sustain a prolonged war against such an opponent. This understanding, born from observation rather than indoctrination, from material experience rather than propaganda, would prove to be the most powerful education any of these prisoners could have received. It was education in the nature of modern industrial warfare. It was education in the relationship between economic capacity and military outcome. It was education that no official re-education program could have provided more effectively than the simple, material reality of daily life in an American prisoner of war camp. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. For the 425,000 German prisoners held in American camps, the immediate question was not whether they had lost. The evidence for that was overwhelming, accumulated through months of observation. The question was what would happen next. Would they be held indefinitely? Would they face punishment or retribution for their service in the Wehrmacht? Would they be transferred to Soviet custody, a prospect that filled prisoners with genuine terror? Or would they be repatriated to a Germany that no longer existed in any recognizable form? The repatriation process, when it began, revealed the depth of the transformation that had occurred in the minds of many German prisoners. Those held in camps in America had witnessed industrial abundance. They had eaten well. They had lived in relative security. They had observed that Americans treated them, despite being enemies, with adherence to the Geneva Convention. Most importantly, they had come to understand their defeat not as a moral or ideological failure, but as an economic inevitability. They had lost because America could produce more. Now they faced the reality of return. Germany, in May of 1945, was utterly devastated. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble by years of Allied bombing. Industrial capacity was destroyed. The economy was in complete collapse. Food was scarce. Housing was destroyed or inadequate. The infrastructure of civilization itself was fractured. Millions of refugees from eastern territories were flooding westward, fleeing Soviet occupation. The German state, as a functional entity, had ceased to exist. For many prisoners, the prospect of repatriation meant returning not to their homes but to ruins. Millions of Germans had fled eastward before the advancing Soviet forces, creating an unprecedented refugee crisis. For prisoners from territories that now lay behind Soviet-controlled borders, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, Return meant not going home but facing an impossible choice. Return to Soviet-occupied territory risked execution or deportation to labor camps in Siberia. Remain in American captivity indefinitely. Or attempt escape into the American population, a gamble with uncertain odds. The statistics of desperation were documented by American military officials. Between 1945 and 1946, 2,222 escape attempts were recorded by German prisoners in American camps. This represented less than 1% of the total prisoner population. Most escapees were recaptured within days. The vast distances of America, the language barrier, the lack of underground networks to shelter fugitives, all of these made successful escape nearly impossible. Yet prisoners still attempted it. They attempted it because the alternative, for many, seemed worse than capture and the subsequent punishment. One man succeeded where thousands failed. Georg Gartner, a 24-year-old sergeant from Rommel's Afrika Korps, escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, on September 22, 1945. He had studied the schedule of freight trains passing near the camp. He had calculated the timing of guard rotations. On that autumn night, he crawled under 2 fence lines and sprinted toward the railroad tracks. He boarded a westbound train heading toward California. What followed was an odyssey that would last 4 decades. Gartner would live as Dennis F. Wilds, adopting a name he borrowed from a migrant farm family he traveled with from Arkansas. He worked as a dishwasher, a lumberjack, a ski instructor at Sugar Bowl in Tahoe, a tennis professional. He obtained a Social Security card. He married Jean Clark in 1964, adopted her 2 children, and built a life in Southern California. He became a construction estimator and architectural consultant, designing and building custom homes. He lived openly, despite the FBI maintaining him on their wanted list. J. Edgar Hoover personally signed his arrest warrant. Wanted posters hung in 10,000 post offices across America. Yet Gartner lived among Americans, worked with Americans, married an American woman, and built a life that became indistinguishable from that of ordinary American citizens. In 1952, he appeared in a magazine photograph. Life magazine documented a rescue effort when the city of San Francisco's train became stranded in a Sierra Nevada blizzard. Gartner was part of the rescue team. He was photographed in the rescue effort. FBI wanted posters hung in nearby post offices. Yet no one connected the man in the photograph to the fugitive prisoner. For 4 decades, Gartner lived the life that many German prisoners dreamed of in their camps. He experienced American freedom. He experienced American opportunity. He experienced the ability to work, to build, to create a future in a nation where his labor and ingenuity were valued. He lived the version of America that German prisoners had glimpsed in the camps, not as captives, but as participants. In 1984, facing pressure from his wife to confront his past, Gartner confessed his true identity. The following year, he contacted historian Arnold Kramer and co-authored a book titled Hitler's Last Soldier in America. On September 11, 1985, he surrendered to Bryant Gumbel on NBC's Today Show. The government faced a legal impossibility. Gartner had committed no federal crime. Escape from a POW camp was not prosecutable under federal law. He could not be deported. He had been brought to America against his will. He could not be charged with illegal entry because he had never technically entered the country as an immigrant. The FBI announced it had no further interest in him. The Immigration and Naturalization Service confirmed no interest in deportation. Gartner had achieved through escape what thousands of other prisoners attempted but failed to achieve. He had remained in America. In November of 2009, at the age of 88, Gartner finally became an American citizen in Denver, Colorado. He died in Loveland, Colorado, in 2013, having lived 68 years in the country he was supposed to have been expelled from in 1945. His life, lived in the shadows but lived freely, represented the profound transformation that American captivity had created. He had come as an enemy. He had departed, ultimately, as a citizen. Yet Gartner's successful escape was exceptional. For the vast majority of German prisoners, repatriation proceeded according to official channels and international law. Most were returned to the American zone of occupied Germany by 1946. Some were retained for additional labor service in Britain and France, a violation of Geneva Convention provisions justified as war reparations. The last German prisoners were not fully released from Allied custody until 1949, 4 years after the war's end. What they carried with them, when repatriation finally occurred, was not just memories of comfortable captivity. They carried an understanding of American industrial capacity that would shape their perception of the post-war world. They carried testimony to the material reality of American abundance. They carried knowledge of a nation that could feed its prisoners adequately while simultaneously waging global war. This knowledge would influence how they understood their defeat and what might be possible for Germany's future. The impact on post-war German society was profound, though often unquantified. Prisoners who returned as legal immigrants in the years following the war, approximately 5,000 former POWs, successfully immigrated to America between 1948 and 1952, under provisions of the Displaced Persons Act, carried with them direct experience of American life. Many established businesses. Many brought American agricultural techniques and business practices back to Germany. Their success became evidence within Germany that life in America was possible, that opportunity existed there, that the industrial abundance they had witnessed in the camps was not an aberration, but a sustainable characteristic of American society. The letters that returned prisoners sent back to Germany reinforced this message. Former prisoners who had remained in America described their lives, their work, their opportunities. These letters circulated among families still in Germany, often translated and shared. They became informal testimony to the possibility of German-American integration, to the capacity of Germany to benefit from American economic strength, and to the reality that the enemy who had defeated Germany possessed not malice but abundance. American generosity in the camps, which had seemed incomprehensible to prisoners trained to believe in American cruelty, revealed itself in retrospect as not generosity but standard practice. This was how America treated enemies, with adherence to law, with provision of adequate resources, with respect for human dignity. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 provided the first major legal pathway for former POWs to immigrate to America. Requirements included American sponsors, proof of non-Nazi party membership, and demonstrated means of support. Between 1948 and 1952, approximately 5,000 former German prisoners successfully navigated this process. They became American residents, then American citizens. Their children and grandchildren now constitute a significant portion of German-American families. Their integration into American society provided living testimony to the possibility of transformation from enemy to ally, from prisoner to citizen. Historian Barbara Schmitter, Heisler's research, based on interviews with 35 former prisoners who had successfully immigrated, documented the consistency of their assessment. The vast majority rated their treatment as prisoners as good or excellent. Most had maintained correspondence with American families for decades after repatriation. Many had developed genuine friendships with Americans during their captivity, relationships that survived the war and the subsequent decades of separation. When the opportunity for repatriation as legal immigrants arose, many seized it. These men did not flee America out of shame or difficulty. They returned by choice. They repatriated when ordered to do so. But when legal pathways for return to America opened, many of them came back. They came back because they had experienced what American life offered. They came back because they had been treated humanely as enemies and believed they would be treated fairly as immigrants. They came back because they understood, at a fundamental level, that the future belonged to industrial powers like America and that Germany's future lay in alignment with American principles and American economic strength. The psychological transformation these men underwent was real but subtle. They did not become American patriots overnight. Loyalty to their homeland did not evaporate. Attachment to German culture and German identity persisted. But something had shifted. They understood their defeat not as a moral or ideological failure, but as an economic reality. They understood that Germany could only recover by integrating into an American-led economic system. They understood that the antagonism that had characterized German-American relations was not natural or inevitable, but was rooted in Germany's attempt to challenge American industrial supremacy. The path forward lay not in renewed conflict, but in cooperation and integration. The Marshall Plan, which provided economic assistance to rebuild Western Europe, including Germany, was justified to American taxpayers as an investment in preventing communist expansion and rebuilding trading partners. But for many former German POWs, the Marshall Plan represented something more profound. It represented American abundance being deployed to rebuild the nation that America had defeated. It represented the victor sharing its industrial capacity with the vanquished. It represented the possibility of genuine transformation and reconciliation based on economic cooperation rather than continued antagonism. Former prisoners who had achieved prominence in post-war Germany became ambassadors for this new relationship. Walter Hallstein, educated at Fort Getty in a special re-education program, would later help design the European Economic Community. His education in American democracy principles, combined with his understanding of American industrial capacity, shaped his vision of European economic integration based on American models. Hans Kroll, held at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States, serving as a bridge between the two nations. Rüdiger von Verhaar, detained at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations, advocating for international cooperation and the integration of Germany into the Western Alliance. These were not isolated cases. Throughout the ranks of post-war German leadership, there were men who had been prisoners in America, who had witnessed American abundance, who understood at a visceral level why Germany had lost and what Germany needed to do to recover. Their influence, though often subtle and undocumented, shaped the trajectory of post-war German-American relations. The alternative was almost unthinkable. If German prisoners had been treated brutally, if they had been starved, if they had been subjected to deliberate cruelty, the post-war relationship between America and Germany would have been fundamentally different. The fact that German prisoners were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, that they were fed adequately, that they were given access to canteen goods and recreational opportunities, meant that when these men returned to Germany, they carried testimony not to American cruelty, but to American respect for law and human dignity, even in war. This testimony, perhaps more than any official policy or propaganda, shaped post-war German attitudes toward America. The statistical record of escape attempts supports this interpretation. Less than 1% of German prisoners attempted to escape. Of those, most were recaptured quickly. Only 7 prisoners were never accounted for at the end of repatriation. This extraordinarily low rate of escape compared to historical rates in other nations and other contexts suggests that most German prisoners, despite being thousands of miles from home, did not attempt to flee. They remained in captivity. They served out their time. They accepted repatriation when ordered. This acceptance was possible not because they were disciplined or broken in spirit, but because many of them understood, at some level, that American captivity was preferable to German civilian life during the war's final years and its immediate aftermath. Some prisoners did resist repatriation actively. At Fort Eustis, Virginia, German prisoners engaged in organized resistance to the repatriation process. They destroyed identification documents. They feigned illnesses. They staged work slowdowns and strikes. They engaged in passive resistance on a scale that required American military authorities to deploy substantial resources to overcome. These prisoners, primarily those from territories that would fall under Soviet control after the war, were motivated by terror of Soviet occupation and Soviet repatriation. They knew that return to Soviet-controlled territories meant high probability of death or Siberian labor camps. Yet even these prisoners, engaging in active resistance to repatriation, did not express hatred toward America or Americans. Their resistance was motivated by fear of Soviet occupation, not by anger at their American captors. Some committed suicide rather than face repatriation to Soviet territories. The desperation that drove these men was not rooted in mistreatment by Americans, but in the knowledge of what awaited them if they were returned to Soviet-controlled zones. Operation Keelhaul, conducted between August of 1946 and May of 1947, forcibly repatriated 2.75 million Soviet nationals from Western Allied zones back to Soviet territory. American intelligence later estimated that 50% of those forcibly repatriated were either executed or sent to Siberian labor camps. German prisoners knew of these forced repatriations. They witnessed them, in many cases, from behind fence lines at American camps. At Camp Shanks in New York, the primary deportation facility for German prisoners, guards reported that German prisoners watched through fences as Soviet prisoners were forcibly loaded onto ships, sometimes resisting, sometimes attempting suicide rather than board the vessels. This knowledge that American treatment of prisoners was not universal, that Soviet treatment was devastatingly brutal, that the difference between American and Soviet captivity was literally the difference between survival and death, reinforced the fundamental realization that had been forming in German prisoners' minds. America was different. America was wealthy enough to feed enemies adequately. America was governed by law. America respected, at minimum, the formal provisions of international conventions. This was not true of the Soviet Union. This was not true of Japan. This was not true of the Nazi regime itself. America was exceptional in its commitment to these principles, and this exceptionalism was rooted in its industrial capacity, its wealth, and its ability to afford humane treatment, even of enemies. The legacy of the German POW experience in America shaped not just German-American relations, but American policy toward enemy combatants for generations to come. The principle that prisoners should be treated humanely, that international law should be respected even in war, that enemies could potentially be transformed into allies through demonstration of American values. These principles, tested and validated during the German POW experience, became embedded in American military doctrine. The camps themselves are now mostly gone. Of 500 POW facilities constructed during the war, few remain intact. Most were converted to other uses or demolished. Yet their impact persists. In some locations, historical societies maintain records. Museums preserve the history. Annual reunions bring together former prisoners and local Americans, creating connections that span generations. In Alona, Iowa, a POW museum commemorates the camps. In Hearne, Texas, barracks and artwork created by prisoners are preserved. In these places, the story is kept alive not as a military history, but as a human history of transformation. The story of German POWs in America ultimately transcends the history of World War II. It reveals something fundamental about the nature of industrial warfare, about the relationship between economic capacity and military outcome, about the capacity of material conditions to shape consciousness and understanding. German prisoners came to understand why they had lost not through propaganda or formal re-education, but through the simple, undeniable experience of American abundance. They learned it in the warmth of barracks heated against winter cold. They learned it in the adequacy of meals that included meat and fresh vegetables. They learned it in the ability to purchase ice cream and Coca-Cola with a day's wages. They learned it in the comfort of Pullman railroad cars used to transport them. They learned it in the scale of American farms and factories that processed agricultural products in quantities that exceeded anything conceivable in Germany. They learned it in the simple fact that America could afford to treat its enemies humanely while simultaneously waging global war. This was the education that mattered. Not the books, not the democracy lectures, not the newspapers. It was the education of material reality. It was the understanding that came from direct observation of how a wealthy nation functions, how it produces, how it allocates resources. It was the comprehension that modern industrial warfare is not decided by courage or tactics, but by the fundamental capacity of one nation to produce more than another nation can produce. For Günter Gräwe, this understanding crystallized in that moment in the camp canteen, when he held both an ice cream cone and a bottle of Coca-Cola in his hands simultaneously. For Georg Gartner, it led to a 40-year odyssey as a fugitive that ultimately transformed into a life of freedom and citizenship in the nation he had fought against. For thousands of other prisoners, it led to a gradual acceptance of defeat not as shame but as inevitable mathematics, and ultimately to participation in the post-war rebuilding of Europe through American leadership and American economic integration. The German POWs, who refused to leave America, who escaped or who immigrated when legal pathways opened, represented the ultimate validation of this understanding. They had come as enemies, they had been treated as humans, they had experienced abundance and dignity, they had learned why Germany had lost, and they had chosen, when given the chance, to remain in the nation that had defeated them, recognizing in America not an enemy but a future. This is the documented story, verified through military records, congressional testimony, and historical research. It demonstrates that even in war's aftermath, transformation remains possible. Enemies can become allies. Prisoners can recognize freedom even behind barbed wire. And the greatest power of all is not military might, but the simple capacity to be wealthy enough to treat enemies humanely, and thereby to demonstrate values that transcend the categories of war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.